Dr. Elena Vargas leaned forward in her seat, her fingers gripping the armrests of the observation deck as TOI-5713b came into view. The planet hung against the backdrop of its dim red dwarf sun, a massive orb of deep crimson streaked with jagged mountain ranges. It looked like a wound carved into the fabric of space, raw and pulsing with latent energy. Even through the thick starship glass, it seemed alive. The crew of the Asterion was a patchwork of nations and disciplines, united by a single goal: to uncover the secrets of the so-called Super Earth. For decades, humanity had gazed at exoplanets as distant promises, distant possibilities. But TOI-5713bi was different. Its atmosphere was rich in oxygen. Its gravity was intense but survivable. And most tantalizingly, it emitted a faint rhythmic signal from beneath its surface, one that resembled the structured patterns of a heartbeat. Elena had reviewed the data 1,000 times during the months-long journey from Earth. The signal wasn't natural. It pulsed in a pattern, a low-frequency wave almost undetectable by conventional equipment. Its structure defied categorization, neither geological nor mechanical. If it wasn't a cry for help, it was something far stranger. Landing on the planet was uneventful. Too uneventful, Elena thought, as the shuttle's engines whispered to a halt on the barren surface. The initial steps out onto TOI-5713b felt surreal. Crimson dust clung to their boots, swirling into the air with every movement. The atmosphere was thin but breathable, just as the instruments had promised. Elena tasted the metallic tang of iron with every breath. The horizon stretched endlessly, broken only by towering, jagged peaks that seemed to lean inward, as if conspiring to trap them. "Geology team, you're up," said Commander Wei Zhang, his voice clipped but steady. Wei was a military man turned explorer, always focused on the mission. He stood at the edge of the shuttle's ramp, scanning the alien terrain with a sharpness that never faltered. The geologists moved swiftly, setting up drilling equipment at the epicenter of the faint signal. Elena couldn't tear her eyes away from the mountains, which seemed to shimmer in the reddish haze, like heat waves distorting their edges. But the air was cold, bitterly so. She shivered and joined her assistant, Malik Carter, at the makeshift lab they had set up inside the shuttle. "Preliminary readings are all over the place," Malik muttered, adjusting the dials on a handheld analyzer. His face was taut with concentration, the bright lights of the equipment reflecting in his dark eyes. Magnetic anomalies, seismic inconsistencies. It's like the whole planet is twitching. "Twitching?" Elena asked, arching an eyebrow. "That's the best way I can describe it." He gestured at the monitor, which displayed a chaotic overlay of data streams. "Every few minutes, there's a faint tremor, perfectly synchronized with the signal. It's not tectonic. It's something else." The drilling team broke through the surface by late afternoon. What they found silenced the usual chatter of the crew. The ground beneath TOI-5713b's brittle crust wasn't solid. It was soft, almost gelatinous, and glimmered with an iridescent sheen when exposed to the pale sunlight. The lead geologist, Sasha Kim, scraped a sample into a vial, her gloves coated in the strange substance. "Organic," she said quietly, her voice tinged with unease. "It's definitely organic." Elena's heart quickened. She peered at the substance through the shuttle's viewport as Sasha carried it to the lab. Under the microscope, the sample revealed its secrets in horrifying detail. The liquid wasn't just organic, it was teeming with life. Microscopic cells squirmed and writhed, responding to the light from the lab's equipment. They moved with a kind of purpose that Elena had only ever seen in predatory organisms. "Are they reacting to us?" Malik asked, leaning closer to the screen. "Not just reacting," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. "They're aware." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the crimson landscape darkened to an inky black. The rhythmic pulse grew stronger, audible now as a low hum reverberating through the shuttle. It set Elena's teeth on edge, a deep vibration that seemed to echo in her bones. The crew tried to dismiss it as harmless, but no one could sleep. Shadows flickered at the corners of their vision, fleeting and insubstantial. By morning, several crew members reported headaches and nausea. Malik was the first to notice the bruises forming along his forearm. "It's just from the pressure," he said dismissively, but his voice lacked conviction. On the third night, the pulse began to affect the equipment. Monitors flickered and data streams became corrupted. The signal grew louder, an almost deliberate rhythm that mocked the team's attempts to understand it. When Sasha fainted in the middle of the lab, Elena knew they had crossed a line. "I think it's time we reconsider our mission," Commander Wei said as they gathered in the cramped control room. "This planet isn't what we thought it was." Elena wanted to argue, but the words caught in her throat. A sudden tremor rattled the shuttle, the strongest yet. Outside, the crimson ground cracked open, revealing a glimmering network of tendrils beneath the surface. The signal spiked, its pattern shifting into something faster, more insistent. It wasn't just a pulse, it was a call, and something deep within TOI-5713b was beginning to answer. Elena didn't sleep. None of them did. The pulse had grown from a faint vibration into a tangible force, reverberating through the walls of the Asterion like a relentless drumbeat. It was no longer an ambient anomaly. It felt alive. Every corner of the ship seemed to hum with it, as though the vessel itself were becoming a part of the planet. Malik's condition worsened overnight. The bruises on his forearm had darkened, spreading like ink beneath his skin. By morning, they had begun to ooze a thin, iridescent liquid. He was feverish, his breathing shallow, but when Elena tried to move him to the quarantine bay, he resisted. "I'm fine," he insisted, but his voice was hoarse, almost inhuman. His eyes, bloodshot and sunken, darted nervously around the lab as if he expected something to burst through the walls. The iridescent substance from the drill sample had become the center of their research, but the more they studied it, the more incomprehensible it became. Under the microscope, its cells moved in deliberate patterns, forming structures that mimicked earthly organisms, veins, nerves, even rudimentary eyes. Elena shuddered as one of the cells seemed to look back at her. "It's adapting," she muttered to herself, her breath fogging the glass of the microscope. Commander Wei entered the lab, his usually stoic demeanor fractured by a rare unease. "How's Malik?" he asked, glancing at the quarantine bay's sealed door. "Not good," Elena admitted. The infection is accelerating. Whatever this substance is, it's not just biological. It's intelligent. Wei's jaw tightened. Can it be contained? I don't think so, she said. The cells replicate too quickly. They're not just invading his body, they're changing it. Her words hung in the air like a death sentence. Before Wei could respond, a sudden tremor shook the ship, stronger than any they had experienced. The lights flickered and the pulse surged, louder now, almost deafening. Outside, the ground cracked further, exposing more of the shimmering, gelatinous tendrils beneath the surface. Sasha burst into the lab, her face pale. The growth, it's spreading, she said, her voice trembling. It's in the shuttle bay. She was interrupted by a guttural scream from the quarantine bay. Elena and Wei froze as Malik's voice turned into an unrecognizable howl. The sound was layered, a chorus of tones that didn't belong to any human throat. They rushed to the observation window, their breath fogging the glass as they stared in horror. Malik was convulsing on the bed, his body writhing unnaturally. His limbs twisted and elongated, his joints snapping audibly as they bent in impossible directions. The lesions on his skin split open, revealing tendrils of shimmering, translucent tissue that pulsed in time with the planetary signal. His eyes rolled back, and when they snapped forward again, they were no longer his. They were black, featureless, and predatory. Elena, Wei said quietly, his hand on her shoulder. He's gone. No, she whispered, shaking her head. We can still... Malik's transformation completed with a sickening crunch as his spine arched backward, his body no longer human. The tendrils erupted from his chest, snapping against the walls of the bay like whips. The reinforced glass of the observation window began to crack as Malik, or what he had become, slammed against it. We have to contain this, Wei said, pulling her away. Now! Before Elena could argue, the glass shattered. The force knocked them backward, shards slicing into their suits. Malik, or the thing he had become, emerged from the bay, his tendrils writhing as he let out another unearthly howl. Sasha screamed, scrambling for the door, but the tendrils lashed out, wrapping around her leg and dragging her back. Elena could only watch in horror as the tendrils burrowed into Sasha's skin, her cries turning into choked gasps as the infection took hold. Wei grabbed Elena by the arm, pulling her to her feet. We have to move, he shouted, his voice barely audible over the pulse and the chaos. They ran through the ship, the corridors now darkened and humid. The iridescent growths had spread, covering the walls and ceiling in a living, pulsating network. Equipment sparked and short-circuited as the organic material consumed the ship's systems. Elena's mind raced, piecing together the horrifying truth. This planet, she said between gasps. It's alive, the whole thing. The signal isn't a call for help, it's a trap, a lure. Wei nodded grimly. And we walked right into it. They reached the bridge, sealing the door behind them. The remaining crew huddled together, their faces pale and slick with sweat. Elena could see the early signs of infection in some of them, dark veins creeping up their necks, the faint shimmer of iridescence in their eyes. We need a plan, Wei said, his voice steady despite the chaos. The ship is compromised. If we don't get off this rock soon, none of us are leaving. Elena stared at the planet's surface on the main monitor. The tendrils beneath the crust were moving, converging toward the ship's landing site. It was no longer just a planet. It was a predator, and they were its prey. She clenched her fists, determination overriding her fear. "There's still a chance," she said, turning to the others. "If we can trace the source of the signal, we might be able to disrupt it, cut off its control." "And how do you propose we do that?" Wei asked, raising an eyebrow. Elena hesitated, glancing at the pulsating growths on the screen. "We drill deeper." The Asterion groaned as the planet tightened its grip. Iridescent tendrils spread through the corridors, twisting and coiling around the ship's infrastructure like invasive roots. Every step echoed with the wet, sickening sound of organic matter growing and pulsating beneath their boots. The ship's artificial lighting was dimming as the alien growths devoured the power supply. Even the air felt heavier, infused with a strange metallic tang that stung Elena's throat with every breath. Elena and Commander Wei worked tirelessly in the control room, their movements frantic but methodical. The surviving crew, what remained of them, huddled in the corners, their faces pale and streaked with sweat. The infection was spreading faster now. Dark veins webbed their arms and necks, glowing faintly in the dim light. No one spoke of the changes, but Elena could see it in their eyes. The creeping horror of losing their humanity. "The signal's source is approximately 3 kilometers below the surface," Wei said, studying the flickering holographic display. "The planet's core, or whatever it's using as a brain." "We don't have 3 kilometers of drill," Elena replied, her voice edged with frustration. "Not with the tendrils compromising the equipment. We're running out of time." Wei turned to her, his expression grim. "Then we make time. We don't have another option." Before she could respond, the ship shuddered violently. Elena grabbed the edge of the console as the floor tilted beneath her. A deafening screech echoed through the hull, followed by the sound of metal tearing. The tendrils had breached the aft section, and the entire ship was being consumed. A distant scream cut through the chaos, a sound that Elena knew all too well by now. "They're coming," Wei said, his hand tightening around the plasma cutter strapped to his belt. Elena swallowed hard and nodded. She turned to the remaining crew, her voice firm despite the rising panic in her chest. "Anyone who can move, come with me. We're going to the lab to retrieve the last of the drilling equipment. Stay together and—" A guttural growl cut her off, reverberating through the corridor outside. The sound was low and wet, accompanied by the squelching of tendrils dragging across the floor. The shadows beyond the doorway shifted, moving unnaturally. Elena's stomach clenched as the silhouette of a figure emerged, long, distorted limbs and a body twisted beyond recognition. It was Sasha, or what was left of her. The infection had claimed her completely, fusing her with the alien growths. Her eyes glowed black, and her jaw hung open at an impossible angle, emitting a low, guttural hiss. The infected Sasha lunged into the room, her tendrils whipping toward the nearest crew member. The man screamed as they coiled around his neck, lifting him off the ground. Wei moved swiftly, firing his plasma cutter, the beams slicing through the tendrils. Sasha's body writhed and convulsed, but she didn't stop. She never stopped. "Go!" Wei shouted, motioning for the others to follow Elena. "Get to the lab." Elena led the group down the corridor, the walls pulsating with alien growths. Every few steps, they had to cut through tendrils blocking their path, the glowing, translucent tissue sizzling as it burned. The screams and sounds of struggle behind them grew fainter, but they never truly disappeared. Elena knew Wei was buying them time, and she knew what it would cost him. The lab was in shambles. Equipment lay scattered on the floor, overtaken by the alien infection. Iridescent tendrils snaked through the machinery, their movements deliberate, as if they were searching. Elena's hands trembled as she rummaged through the wreckage, pulling out the portable drill unit and its power cells. "We've got it," she said, turning to the others. "Let's move." A deafening roar erupted from the corridor, shaking the walls. The tendrils around them recoiled, quivering violently. Elena froze, her breath hitching in her throat. Something massive was moving toward them, its footsteps heavy and wet. "It's in here," one of the crew members whispered, his voice trembling. "It's in—" The wall beside them exploded, a mass of tendrils and malformed limbs bursting through. The creature was enormous, its body a grotesque amalgamation of infected flesh and alien growths. It moved with terrifying speed, its many limbs reaching for them. Elena fired her plasma torch, but the beam barely slowed it down. "Run!" she shouted, clutching the drill as she sprinted toward the exit. The remaining crew followed, their screams echoing through the corridors. One by one they fell, their cries cut short as the creature's tendrils ensnared them. Elena reached the central shaft, gasping for breath as she sealed the door behind her. She was alone now. The drill's weight dragged on her arms, but she pushed forward, descending deeper into the ship. The pulse was deafening here, a relentless rhythm that resonated through her chest. The lower levels were unrecognizable, transformed into a living hive of alien tissue. The tendrils seemed to move faster now, reacting to her presence. She could feel them watching her, their movements synchronized with the pulse. When she reached the drilling site, she collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. The final drill point was marked, a narrow shaft leading into the planet's core. Elena activated the drill, the machine roaring to life as it tore into the crimson rock. The ground shuddered violently, the pulse spiking with every inch the drill descended. Elena glanced at the walls, now writhing with tendrils that lashed toward her. She held them off with the plasma cutter, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. The drill whined as it hit resistance, its tip sparking against something harder than rock. The pulse shifted, growing chaotic and erratic. The planet was fighting back. With a final ear-splitting crack, the drill pierced through. The signal exploded in intensity, a soundless scream that reverberated through the ship. The tendrils spasmed, their movements disjointed and chaotic. For a brief moment, the infection faltered. Elena didn't wait to see what would happen next. She grabbed the drill's core sample and began her ascent, the walls trembling violently around her. The planet wasn't dying. It was angry, and it was coming for her. Elena stumbled into the ship's upper deck, her body a trembling wreck of exhaustion and terror. The core sample was clutched to her chest, its iridescent glow pulsing faintly, mirroring the dying rhythm of the planet's signal. The walls of the Asterion shuddered and groaned around her, as if the ship itself were on the verge of collapse. Every surface was coated with the alien growth, now thrashing wildly in uncoordinated spasms. The planet was aware of her act. It was furious, and it was reaching. The remaining escape pod sat at the far end of the docking bay, its entry hatch open like a final lifeline. Commander Wei's voice crackled weakly through the comm system, barely audible over the chaos. "Elena, status?" "I have the core," she gasped, forcing her legs to keep moving. Every step felt like lifting lead weights. Her body was failing her, the infection spreading beneath her skin. She could feel the alien veins pulsing in time with her own heartbeat, her blood no longer entirely her own. "I just need to get to the pod." "Hurry," Wei said, his voice breaking. "The tendrils are breaching the upper levels. If you don't make it in time—" "I'm coming," she shouted, even as her vision blurred and her knees buckled. Her hands hit the floor, warm and wet with alien fluid. The core slipped from her grasp, rolling a few feet ahead. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as the iridescent light seemed to grow brighter, mocking her weakness. A deafening roar filled the bay, vibrating through the walls and floor. Elena turned her head slowly, her neck stiff and aching. The creature loomed in the doorway behind her, its massive form silhouetted by the chaotic red emergency lights. It was no longer just one entity. It was an amalgamation of every infected crew member, their bodies fused into a writhing, grotesque mass. Human faces peeked out from the tangle of tendrils, their expressions frozen in agony. Somewhere in that nightmare of flesh, she saw what was left of Sasha and Malik, their eyes black and unseeing. It surged toward her, the floor buckling beneath its weight. Tendrils lashed out, cracking against the walls and sweeping aside equipment as it closed the distance. Elena's instincts screamed at her to run, but her body refused to obey. Instead, she reached for the core, her infected arm pulsating and cracking as the alien veins beneath her skin began to surface. "Not yet," she whispered through gritted teeth, gripping the core tightly. "Not until I finish this." She forced herself upright, her legs shaking violently. The escape pod was only meters away, but the creature was faster. It lunged at her, its tendrils striking out. Elena twisted her body, the sharp tips of the appendages grazing her side, ripping her suit and drawing blood. Pain lanced through her, but she staggered forward, clutching the core like a lifeline. The pod's hatch loomed closer. Wei's voice crackled again. "You're almost there. Don't stop." With a final burst of strength, Elena hurled herself into the pod, slamming her fist against the interior controls. The hatch groaned shut just as the tendrils struck it, denting the metal with horrifying force. Elena collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air as the pod detached from the ship. Through the viewport, she saw the Asterion being swallowed whole by the planet's growths, its once pristine structure, now an extension of the alien organism. "Prepare for detonation," Wei's voice said, a haunting calmness in his tone. "No," Elena whispered, realizing what he meant. "Wei, you can still make it. There's no time," he said. His face appeared briefly on the comm screen, bloodied but resolute. "This is the only way to give you a chance. The ship's reactor will amplify the signal. When it overloads, it should sever the network." Elena shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Wei, please." "Get home," he said firmly. "Tell them what happened here." The screen went dark. Elena's hands trembled as she clutched the core to her chest, watching helplessly as the Asterion began to glow from within. The reactor's overload sequence ignited, sending a shock wave of energy through the planet's surface. The tendrils recoiled, writhing violently, as the pulse of the alien signal fractured and collapsed. The ground split open, geysers of iridescent liquid shooting into the air like the blood of a wounded beast. The explosion ripped through the Asterion, consuming the ship in a brilliant flash of light. The shockwave hurled the escape pod into the upper atmosphere. Elena braced herself against the violent turbulence, tears streaking down her cheeks as Wei's final act shattered the planet's control. From orbit, the scene below was apocalyptic. TOI-5713B's surface convulsed, its once unified tendril network disintegrating into chaos. The Crimson Mountains collapsed inward, sinking into a sea of shimmering liquid. The planet let out one last tremor, a dying shudder that reverberated through the pod. For a moment, there was silence. Elena exhaled slowly, her hands trembling as she set the core sample on the console. She was alive. But as she looked down at her arms, she saw the veins beneath her skin glowing faintly, the infection still pulsing through her body. She closed her eyes, leaning back in the pod's seat as the stasis system activated. The faint hum of the engines soothed her as the pod drifted into the void, its course set for Earth. The infection wasn't gone, and neither was the planet's memory. As the pod entered stasis, the faint rhythmic pulse of TOI-5713B's signal echoed through the silence, barely perceptible but there, like a heartbeat that refused to stop.